you want to say a little something about Dumont, so maybe we'll start there, because you were saying about experimental, so we'll start with Dumont, and then we'll go back to ABC. You had when we ended the last tape, you said yeah, when I got to New York. Okay, we're back on, and you were talking about arriving in New York and the state of television at the time of your arrival when you moved there.
Well, it was still quite experimental. There was only one television studio in New York. It was Dumont, downtown. I was curious about it, and I did get to go inside and see what was going on. It was later than that. While I was working in an advertising agent, CBS really opened up their studio, as I think I mentioned, was in Grand Central Station.
What attracted you to television?
Well, I don't know that. What really attracted me was, to me, it seemed that this was a whole new industry just beginning, like the movies in the silent days, and that this was the time to become involved. And my involvement could be using my art training and interest in scenery and things like that.
Did you have a vision when you looked at the screen? Were you thinking my style would really work on television?
Well, I didn't quite know what my style was then, but I did like doing things that were not particularly realistic, that were more fanciful. And the first few things I did for people other than Mr. Pele's ballet were produced by Broadway producers and were musical in nature. It was after I got to ABC, after I'd joined the union and gone to ABC, that I started doing other kinds of things. As I said, the first thing I did was, John Daly was head of news for ABC, and I did a set for him. He was on every Sunday with the news program, and then I started doing, with another designer, the Paul Whiteman Show, a big musical.
Going back to that news program, what did that set look like?
Well, it was probably pretty basic. There was a podium that he stood behind and some flats behind it, but it was done Sunday morning. And one Sunday morning, I arrived at the studio, which was in an old converted theater, and there was no scenery. The truck that was supposed to deliver it didn't deliver it. And very quickly, I found some old flats around, and I did have a scenic touch-up artist there. So we painted the flats, and we put up something temporarily, and we went on the air. And I made a big fuss about it later, and no one ever told me what happened to that truck that didn't arrive from the warehouse. We got to it, though. Television is full of little surprises. But that's really what makes it interesting, I think.
You started in 1952. What was the state of ABC at that time?
Well, there were just a few designers there. There was one big show, which was the Paul Whiteman Show. And I worked on that for a while. And then one day, I got a phone call from Irving Mansfield at CBS offering me a job. And I thought, well, I'm happy here. I didn't say yes and didn't say no, but I told Jim McNaughton, I got a call from ABC. How much were they offering? Well, it turned out twice what I was making at ABC, and he said, take it. And I said, but Jim, you got me started. I feel loyal to ABC and so on. He said, don't be an idiot, take the job. So I did, and I went to work then at CBS. Irving Mansfield was producing a show, a 15-minute show to fill in the 15 minutes of news because, as you know, as everyone knows, television is usually in half-hour blocks or hours. So Irving was doing this 15-minute show starring a well-known singer at the time, Jane Froman. She had entertained the troops and was in a plane that crashed in Portugal and wore a brace on the leg and always wore long gowns to the floor. But she managed to hide the fact that she was still very much impaired. And the show was fun to do. We did two 15-minute shows a week in what is now the Ed Sullivan studio. We always had to paint the floor because it was very dirty and scuffed and had marks all over it. So I would paint the floor and I would scrounge scenery from other shows and paint things differently and ad-lib the scenery. With one show on Monday and another show on Friday. That went on for quite a while. And later I did many other shows for Irving Mansfield. And Some of the early things were quiz shows.
You did the $64,000 challenge.
Yes, I did. The $64,000 question was first, but suddenly they decided $64 question was first. They decided that wasn't enough money, so Revlon, Mr. Revson, head of Revlon, decided to do another show and give away $1,000. And it required 2 contestants, and he wanted them in soundproof booths so they couldn't hear each other speaking. And I decided, since it was a challenge, to make the booths look vaguely like chessmen. And there were lights inside, and it got very hot, and I put tiny little silent air conditioners in there. Mr. Evans said, no, I want to see them sweating. Oh, the director was Joe Cates, brother of Gil Cates. And later, Joe Cates became a rather famous television producer, and I did many, many shows for him. Had a beautiful wife named Lily, Chinese, from San Francisco, and 2 lovely daughters, one of them Phoebe Cates, who became an actress. And I did so many shows for Joe. It was really a big break for me.
Well, going back to the $64,000 challenge, you instituted vinyl flooring on that.
Yes, since it was going to be a chessboard, I found that vinyl flooring, which was rather new, came in 4-foot squares. And so I decided I wanted a vinyl floor. I was tired of painting all the time, painting the floor, so we used the vinyl squares to make a gigantic chessboard. And the show started with the 2 pieces upstage, and they moved down till they were center stage. And I did other quiz shows too. I did something called Dato. The quiz show Scandals came along. I knew nothing about them. In fact, I was as surprised as anyone else to find that they were slightly rigged. But they were. Also, I was doing other things.
Did you create the set for Dato?
No. Oh, yes, I did. I forgot about that. I did.
Can you describe that set?
Well, Dato, there was a piece of paper with a lot of dots on it, and you had to connect the dots, and as soon as you could, recognize the face. That was the game. And I think that was actually the show that was picked on as being the culprit in the quiz show Scandals. About this time, though, Oliver Messel introduced me. Well, actually, Cecil Beaton was coming to New York to do a show. And, excuse me, Oliver gave him my name. The show was A Little Glass Clock, starring Ava Gabor and some other people, and I drafted it all for him, even though I was working at CBS full-time. Got the show and did the lighting, got a credit as lighting designer on it. And then a couple of other shows for Cecil, and finally an opera at the Met, Vanessa. And Cecil was back in London when he did that, and he sent me the sketches, and I had to draft it all up as best I could, doing what I thought he wanted. And I sent them to him, and he said, put them in the shop. So I guess they were all right. We started building it. He arrived rather late in the time. Samuel Barber wrote the opera, and John Colomanati directed it. And I dealt with them exclusively. Cecil arrived and came to one of the last rehearsals and said, everything's fine. And suddenly it was time for him to go have lunch with Dinah Vreeland at Vogue. And I said, but Cecil, you haven't seen one of the sets, and it's opening tonight or tomorrow, whenever. And he said, oh, I'm sure it's fine. And he rushed off to see Dinah Vreeland. He was always rushing off to see Dinah Vreeland. Once he was staying in a hotel on Park Avenue, which has now been torn down, where the Seagram building is, I think, or one of those buildings. And I had done some drafting for him, and I dropped it off in the morning on my way to CBS. And he said, I'm waiting for somebody to come and have her photograph taken. That girl is always late. She's never here on time. Can you stay until she comes? I said, yes. Let me just call CBS and see if everything's all right. I talked to my assistant. No, nobody's looking for her. Everything's fine. Here's the phone number in case somebody needs me for something. Cecil said, call down and order some lunch, and I'm leaving. He went out the door. And a long time passed. I had my lunch, and there was a knock on the door. Nobody called from downstairs, and I opened the door, and there was Marilyn Monroe, that girl who was always late. And I said, oh, Miss Monroe, Mr. Beaton's very sorry he couldn't wait for you. He had a terribly important meeting he had to go to, and he asked me to make another appointment with you. And she said, no, I'll wait. And she sat down and waited, and for half an hour I was sitting there trying not to get caught staring at Marilyn Monroe. A lot of things happened like that in those days.
Did you talk to her or just?
Yes, somewhat, but not too much. I think I was quite intimidated by the whole thing. Finally, Cecil came back, and I left and went to work, and nobody had missed me, which was a good thing.
Were you doing a lot of that? Were you really doing two jobs at once?
Yes, I was, because I was still fascinated with the theater. And that opera was a lot of fun to do.
Bringing it back to television, I want to ask you about Camera 3, your experience on that.
Oh, well, I guess that's what I was working on during that time. Camera 3 was one of my favorite shows, one of my favorite things I ever worked on. Louis Friedman was the director. Robert Herridge was the producer. There was no sponsor. It was a show Mr. Paley watched all the time. It was a very intellectual kind of show. I'd sometimes say to Louis, I have an idea, but I don't know if it'll work. And Louis would say, do it. If it doesn't work, it doesn't matter. There's another show next week. And we did all kinds of things, like Faulkner gave us the rights to As I Lay Dying, which we did with Mildred Dunnock, for $100, and at the same time he wouldn't sell them to the movies because he thought they wouldn't get it right. I remember one thing. There was a book that came out with letters written by Civil War soldiers back home. And so we were going to do that. And I decided to create a battlefield. And I covered all the walls with black velour, painted the floor black, got all the mirrors from rehearsal halls, big mirrors from rehearsal halls the dancers used, put them around in the darkness, and built campfires on the floor and had groups of men sitting around and stacks of rifles and things. And with the mirrors, it looked absolutely endless. It looked bigger than a football field. It looked enormous, and it really worked. And we were always doing things like that, and every show was a challenge. Every show was different. And Louis was wonderful to work with, and some of the most exciting times of my life were on Camera 3, and many of those shows are at the Museum of Modern Art in New York.
We'll talk about Louis Friedman. What did he bring to that show?
Well, it's hard to say. Louis was quite an intellectual, and I worked with him later too. He later became head of PBS Channel 13 in New York, and still later head of the National Arts of the Endowment. He was working in Washington when he died, finally. When CBS decided they were going to do a nighttime variety show with one of their daytime stars, Gary Moore, Ralph Levy was coming back from doing the Jack Benny show out here. He also did the pilot for I Love Lucy out here. But he came back at CBS's request to do the Gary Moore show. And a lot of people were hired. There were two designers. The other designer on it was Gary Smith, the Gary Smith. And we got the first show on, and CBS didn't like it. I think we might have done a second show. I'm not sure. CBS canceled it, and everybody got fired. And they brought Bob Banner from out here, who had been doing the Banner Shore Show and other shows. Bob Banner came to New York with all of his crew to try again to do a Gary Moore show. And I was the only person who was rehired. They didn't even rehire the same stage managers. Nobody had anything to do with that first show except me. And it was really because I showed one sketch to Bob Banner, which fascinated him. It was a sketch of pianos floating in the air with stepladders coming up out of the clouds and people sitting on the stepladders and playing the pianos. Eventually, we did that on the Gary Moore show when we were out here, like a year later. But I think that sketch is why Bob hired me to do the thing. He thought some strange person thought of this thing with floating pianos. But it was wonderful working on that show. And I did it all the years it was on. The last year there was a second designer brought in to sort of give me a little more free time. By that time I was doing a lot of stuff for CBS anyway with the color.
Now, did you actually work with Gary Moore directly as well?
Oh, yes. Oh, Gary Moore was crazy about me. He called me Nutsy Lisanby. I was always thinking of crazy things to do. Like, I wanted one opening number. The opening number always introduced the guests, and I wanted one opening number where the girls were dressed like butterflies with wings. The boys were butterfly catchers with the pith helmets and with the nets that they could capture girls in, all because I wanted the guests to come in on the backs of fluttering butterflies and get off. So anyway, I got on very well with Gary, and he didn't feel that my salary at being paid by CBS was enough. Let me tell you first, in those days, I'll remind you, in those days, a season was 36 weeks, 39 weeks, with 13 weeks off in the summer for vacation. Since I worked overtime all the time, I would have 13 weeks off with pay. But Gary still thought I wasn't making enough money, and he asked his office to send me the same check CBS was paying me every week. So I was doing very well and going to Europe every summer.
What was your typical week-like schedule for the Gary Moore show?
Rough, because we only really worked 2 weeks ahead. The opening numbers and the finales were usually decided by the choreographer, Ernie Flatt, and me. If Ernie said, I want to do an opening where the girls in long skirts are swirling round and round and round, I did a set of giant pinwheels. Or if I wanted to do something particularly, he would do an opening number that just worked with the set because it was a good opening look.
Did you have to worry about budgets?
Oh, yes. We were always on budget. I remember our head of production, told me at the end of, I don't know if it was the first year or not, you know, I just did all the books. It was a big party afterwards. I just did all the books. And you were over budget this year. I said, how much? And he said, oh, less than $200. But you always had to stay on budget. That was part of the deal.
Were there things that you wanted to do that you just never could because of budgetary concerns on that?
No, I always found a way to do it. Always. If I had to steal money from another part of the budget, I would do it.
Did you work with the writers as well?
Yes, we had wonderful writers. Neil Simon. What can I think of the others?
I know Buck Henry was one.
Buck Henry was one,
Woody
yes.
Allen, I think?
Woody Allen was doing a stand-up bit down in the village, and Gary saw him and hired him. He came on. I remember when who did I say was the first writer? Neil Simon. Neil Simon was writing a play, and I wanted to design it, but I didn't get to. We went to the opening night. He did come after a couple of years. He left the show and had his show on Broadway. And he came back to television. He wrote one show specifically for television. It was called The Trouble with People, and he wrote it so his brother Danny could direct it. We shot it out here in California, and we shot it in New York. And it had people like George C. Scott, which is why we came out here. Well, that's a funny story. George C. Scott was, the set for it was some small precinct police station in New York. I went to see one while I was there, and I built it out here. And George C. Scott was sitting in the audience very early in the morning with his script, studying his script, but he was watching me dress the set. There were no set decorators at NBC. And I did things like I had in the corner set up a coffee urn and cups, and I was taking the cups out and putting them around the desk, and I put one on top of a fire extinguisher. And it was a pretty good show. After Mr. Scott was finished, he came over to talk to me, and he congratulated me on the set. And he pointed to the cup that was sitting on top of the fire extinguisher and said, "What's in that cup?" Well, I knew that I'd taken it out of the empty things. I said, "Well, there is about this much coffee and a cigarette butt." He said, go look at it. And I went over and took it down. And he had changed his cup, which had a cigarette in the dregs of the coffee, and put it up there, and hadn't said anything to me. But that's something I'll always remember. It was very funny.
Going back to the Gary Moore show, Carol Burnett got her start on that show.
Yes, she did. I really knew Carol before that. She was a hat check girl in I think it was called the Susan Palmer Tea Shop or something in Rockefeller Center. And I would sometimes have lunch there, and if you upstairs were tables and so on, and you checked your coat. If you could get down the stairs, there was a counter, and you could hang your coat on the wall. And once she chased me all the way down the stairs to get my coat. And the hostess introduced me to her. I didn't remember her name at the time, and said, she's going to be an actress. One day on the Gary Moore show, they needed somebody just to do a standing. It was, I think William Bendix was sitting in the balcony of a movie theater commenting on what was going on the screen, which you couldn't see. And they wanted a girl to be sitting beside him for some comic reasons and so on. And suddenly this girl arrived, and I recognized her. It was Carol Burnett. And so I talked to her. I think Kenny Welch had seen her at that point at the Blue Angel. And they became great friends after that, too. And she became a great friend of mine. And I used to date her when she was on the show. We'd have lunch at the Plaza. She lived on Central Park South. And we had a lot of fun together, and I loved her. And quite early in the time of doing the Gary Moore show, they decided to do a show at Carol and Julie Andrews, Carol and Julie at Carnegie Hall. That was a very famous show. It was a landmark show, and quite wonderful, quite funny. And then she did two other shows. She did
I know she did Once Upon a Mattress.
She did Once Upon a Mattress. She had been, in fact, I think she was appearing in Once Upon a Mattress even while we were doing the show in the early days. And she was in that, and so we did that on television. It was done later in color, but we did it. And we also did another show for her called Calamity Jane, which was written just for her. And it was wonderful working with her every week.
Now, when you would design a set for someone like Carol Burnett, say for Once Upon a Mattress, do you take her personality into account?
Oh, absolutely, you have to. But that was a well-known show, and it also had to be a certain style. It was my style of fragmentary scenery and so on. And it worked very well on television, I thought.
And going back to the Gary Moore show, I know you'd mentioned off camera, you'd said that you had suggested that she come back. Can you talk about that? That after that first appearance that she made?
Oh, that's true. I'd forgotten that. A week later, they needed a girl for a sketch, and I said, well, why didn't you get the girl from last week? She was wonderful. And everybody said, that's a great idea. We loved her. And they hired her. And she became a regular after that. When she came back that time, she never left. She was on with a wonderful older comedian named Marion Lorne, and they played off one another just beautifully. It was wonderful. The show was always a joy to do. I always loved doing it. We always had fun. Everybody liked their work on that show, and Gary kept a very happy crew around him.
Do you have a favorite design that you did from that show?
From the Gary Moore show? Oh, I'm certain I do. I did so many things. It was on for so many years. It's hard to remember them all. Fortunately, I have a lot of photographs.
Do you think viewers responded to the sets that you did?
Pardon?
Did you ever get viewer response from the sets that you did?
Oh, yes. I learned later that a lot of people who are designers now watch that show. I got nominated a number of times for the show, but I never won because they only gave out one Emmy in those days, and it was always The Untouchables that seemed to get it because it was the #1 show in the whole country.
How long did you work on the Gary Moore show?
I think it was on 6 years. I'd have to check it to be sure, but I believe it was on about that long. At the very end, the last year, they brought in another designer, so I only did every other week because I was doing an awful lot of work for Color, CBS Color then. I was sort of in charge of CBS Color. When they were first trying out color things and so on, the only studio space they had was in what was the penthouse at 485 Madison, CBS's building. And the first show that was going to actually be in color was produced by Ed Sullivan and starred people in colorful costumes like Carmen Miranda and other people. But I did a lot of work even before we did that show. I was up there a lot. And the technicians in the control room would leave the mics on in the control room, and while we were trying to work, we would hear them chattering all day long. One day, when they were going out to lunch, I had my painter paint a banana blue because they always had one camera on a bowl of artificial fruit. They had another camera on a dummy with a piece of fabric here. But anyway, when they came back and the blue banana was there, they were very quiet. There was no sound from the control room for a long time. And finally I heard one of them say, well, I've got the banana yellow again, but the orange is green. And about that time I went to lunch myself.
You know how that was resolved? Did you eventually fess up?
No, they knew what had happened. Mr. Paley was always up there, though, seeing what was going on. He was very curious. And Mrs. Paley, the very glamorous Bay Paley, often came in. And what was really going on was CBS had a system for color, which involved a spinning wheel with colors in it, but a mechanical spinning wheel. And RCA had their electronic tube, which didn't give very good color. But I realized that trying to depend on a spinning mechanical wheel in a television set was never going to work. And when the FCC approved the other system, it wasn't very good, but it did improve, and it kept getting better and better. And I did a lot of those early television tests and shows. I think the first show that was in color was The Big Record with Patty Page, I think. And I did that. I think that's why I only did half the shows the last year. And, Paul Barnes did the other half of the last year of the Gary Moore show. So I could spend more time in color.
Now, what kind of things did you have to do to adapt to color from an art director standpoint?
Well, any television, those days, television was not what it is today with high definition. White would flare, and you couldn't use pure white. You had to tone it down. You had to tint it a pale gray or use yellow or something else. You had to compensate a lot. And in the early color things, it wasn't all that good, but it kept getting better and better. And one of the first television shows that was going to be done in color, the first special was Rogers and Hammerstein were asked to write Cinderella for Julie Andrews, and I thought I was going to design it. CBS wanted me to design it, and I had a meeting with Mr. Rogers and Mr. Hammerstein. I finally got to ask somebody, what does it mean, grand rights? Grand rights is a problem you always have in television. If something has been on Broadway, there are grand rights, and you can't copy anything that was there. So I got a chance to ask Mr. Hammerstein, can you define grand rights? And he said, if they're doing something from Showboat and there's a cotton bale on stage, that's grand rights. In any event, in the end, I didn't get to actually design the color show, but I did almost all the early color things for CBS.
Let's stop there to change the tape.
Yeah, okay.